Hello, we're going to give this just a minute to let everybody filter in. Thank you all panelists. Thank you, Lorrie, Janaki, Pam, Gibson. So glad you are all here. All right, so people, I can see people are still filtering in. Give it just a few more minutes. Oh, maybe a minute. How are panelists doing this morning? Good.
Right.
Yes, good.
And enjoying some of the first rain over here in Davis.
Oh, the first rain of the year.
Second rain.
That is so good. Is this one expected to be ½ inch or so? I heard maybe.
It's supposed to create some snow somewhere too.
Oh, good. We need our snowpack. Sheesh, I've been wondering when we will be alleviated from the pressure of imminent fire. Okay, we are ready. Everyone is pretty much here. So I'm going to just introduce and frame this panel for those of you who are just joining us. Again, to reiterate from this morning's framing before Cindy Daly spoke, the idea that our wardrobes are historically for the last few decades been growing in their reliance on fossil fuel-based fiber or fossil carbon-based fiber. We have this effort that we're making in our organization to transition into fibers that can break down, that can be eaten by microbes, that can become part of a nutrient cycle that doesn't impact any one community unfairly, and also is part of just what we would call a more biomimetic way of creating clothing. And so as we do that, we're today exploring some of the realities of, what are the solutions that we need, or framing and solutions that we need to be considering as we make pivots to more biosphere-based economic structures, especially in our textile systems. So we're shifting our focus to natural fibers as we shift our focus to natural dyes. What do we need to know about agricultural systems that produce our textiles? What is agriculture's connection to clean and fresh marine water? What shared understanding can we bring forth through this panel to learn about the most sustaining forms of agriculture that work to improve hydrologic function, that work to improve and promote healthy marine ecosystems? And how do we promote and sustain, and in some cases create, where it doesn't exist already, the human right to clean water? We know the textile industry internationally is very responsible for contaminating fresh water. But as we think about taking more responsibility for our material culture, we have to think about the impacts to our home communities as we rebuild structures that regionalize food and fiber. We have to do so in a way that is life enhancing, life affirming, equitable at its foundation. So to start, we're going to have short presentations, and each of these wonderful panelists are going to have an opportunity to share their work with you. And we are going to start with 12-minute presentations, 10 to 12, and you don't have to take all that time, it's up to you. And the first presenter is Pam Crone, and she'll introduce her work to you through her slides. And Pam, do you have slides today? I didn't ask.
I do, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pam. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for inviting me to be on the panel. Thank you to all the audience who's listening to this. This is a subject very near and dear to my heart. I'm the Agriculture Water Quality Coordinator for the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation. And so water quality is central to my work. and water that flows into the ocean is really important to me, and working together with agriculture to try to have that water to be clean and to try to do other things that can improve water quality in the sanctuary. Wonderful marine life exists in the sanctuary off of California's coast. There's just so much diversity, so many colors and shapes, and so much to see, yet it's so unknown to most of us because it's very hard to get into the ocean to see this life. So we mostly appreciate it through pictures or films, but it's out there and it's very important. And I'm very encouraged that we have some ways that we can help the ecosystem. So just as the climate is changing on the land, so it is changing on the sea. It's not changing the same every place, but differently depending on where you are. But in fact, the ocean has absorbed 80% of the excess heat energy that's happened from global warming. And this has caused an increase in temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the top 700 meters of the surface. Not only that, but the ocean is also a carbon dioxide sink. Carbon dioxide is going into the ocean, and this is increasing carbonic acid or causing ocean acidification. And this is causing difficulties for different kinds of systems in marine organisms, but especially for the shell formation of the shell forming creatures like oysters and clams. So ocean changes are happening in a lot of different ways due to these, due to ocean warming and ocean acidification, physically, chemically, and biologically, as well as the social and economics of the shorelines. So biologically, there's some adaptation that's occurring. There's movement that's occurring. I know we've seen red pelagic crabs on the shorelines in Monterey that usually are only seen in Santa Barbara. There's some mass mortality events that are happening, which is really scary to me because sometimes the ecosystem changes so fast that there isn't the possibility of movement or adaptation. For instance, some of the auklets, 250,000 auklets died when the blob was off the coast here because the ecosystem changed and the usual plankton that they fed on was no longer available because of the warmer waters. So they were found on the beaches all the way from California into Canada. People are also experiencing losses in the shoreline and from extreme weather events. So the ocean's a really important part of the change and something that we need to try to preserve and protect. And there's ways that we can do that in agriculture, which is so encouraging. And one of those ways is through long-term carbon storage in the soil. And this carbon storage not only improves soil health, but it can also slow, and if enough adoption happens, perhaps even start to reverse some of the changes that we're seeing in ocean temperature and acidification. The other way that soil health helps the ocean is that it increases infiltration rate. So as the soil form is improved and the aggregation improves, and as more organic matter is stored in the soil, this reduces the runoff, and runoff oftentimes from agricultural lands can contain fertilizer or nutrients from animal production. It can contain plastic or pesticides. So there's an improvement in water quality if there's less runoff created by these healthier soils. So because we saw these advantages, we decided to apply for the Cdfa Healthy Soils Program grants, and we actually have 3 of them right now. Our first one in year 1 was on a couple of small farms that produce chickens, pigs, sheep, and goats. And our second and third ones have been one on a vegetable farm and then one on a cattle farm, where that farm was used for some of the fire equipment staging in 2016 and 2020. So very highly compacted soils that we're hoping to improve. So our first project is the one that we have some results on and what I will talk about today, which is the small animal farms. We chose that topic because small animal protein is growing worldwide. It's more economical and efficient to produce than cattle protein. There are also advantages that you could produce both protein and fiber. And they can also be raised on smaller plots of land and more accessible to beginning farmers and also in third world countries. So our first goal of this project was to improve soil health and sequester greenhouse gases by adding compost and planting hedgerows. And to know whether we were achieving that goal or not, we chose 4 measures: soil organic matter, plant growth, reduction in outside resources, and increased above ground biodiversity. So we had an experimental design to find out if we were accomplishing those results. So we had both treatment and control plots. We had a total of 4 fields that we sampled. And so our first soil organic matter sample, interestingly, we haven't sampled for year 3 yet, but after year 2, we found that we had increased soil organic matter, not only in our compost plots, but also in our control plots, which puzzled us. So we looked for reasons to find out why that happened. And we came up with 3 theories. One was that our first year was a very low precipitation year. And so there was a lot of exposed soil. And that may have caused a loss of carbon for that first measurement. The second reason is that we weren't able to sample at the same time every year because of the grant requirements, and ideally we would have liked to, but we couldn't. And our third reason, which is the most hopeful to me, and I hope some of this happened, which is that our ranchers were attending and even giving talks at our educational events, and they were learning about soil health just as I was, and just as our attendees were at the different outreach events we had, and they were applying that knowledge at their ranches and using their knowledge to improve soil health on their ranch. So the second measure was peak standing biomass. We just cut quadrats in each of the plots, the control and compost plots, took them home, dried the sample, and measured it at the peak point of the year in April or May. And all 4 plots look approximately like this one. This is our single plot at Monkey Flower Ranch, where the blues show the control plots, and you can see a diminishment in peak standing biomass on those plots and an increase on the compost addition plots, so that the compost addition plots went up almost 40% and the control plots went down almost 50%. So the compost addition plots benefited. There was increased forage production, like you saw on that chart. There was a lower need for inputs. The Monkey Flower Ranch actually brought in less hay that year. Their water use was reduced, and there's increased drought resilience. Both the rancher and the ranch manager commented that the compost plots stayed green for longer than the control plots, and they also noticed the increased forage there. And in addition to farm benefits, there were ecosystem benefits. There was greenhouse gas sequestration, and there was an increase in water efficiency due to the increased soil organic matter, a savings in water on the farm. And there were other benefits, such as the increased infiltration, which would reduce in more groundwater storage and restoring some of the aquifers, putting more water into those, as well as reducing the runoff and benefiting water quality, as I mentioned before. So then we asked the question, well, was this savings enough to really, truly be economical? And so we looked at the cost of the compost, both the compost itself and the application cost. We looked at the savings in terms of reduced need to buy outside forage and reduced water cost. The ranch manager also said that the sheep really preferred forage to hay, and there was an increase in milk production, although we weren't able to come up with a dollar figure for that. But when we looked at all the costs, there was savings to the farm, but not enough to offset the compost unless we also added the greenhouse gas credits. So that's why it's important that we continue to provide these Cdfa grants to the farmers so that they can get some credit beyond just the cost savings to themselves, so that they can get another way to help offset their personal costs and do what's good and what's right for the community and what's right for the world. And I hope that EQIP funding and Cdfa will continue to fund programs like these, as well as possibly other sources. So if we look at all the outcomes from our first healthy soils, there was a higher increase on the soil organic matter on the compost plots, but we actually saw that increase in both plots. There was an increase in water holding capacity, a savings of 32,000 gallons per acre. There was an increased CO2 storage, and this was from Comet Planner, our estimate, which was equal to 4 to 8 household offsets. So we calculated that if 10% of farmland was in California, ranch land was put into these same practices, that would offset all the households in California. There was an increase in peak standing biomass and also in residual dry matter measured at the end of the year. And we held 6 workshops and had 4 open houses and had close to 300 people coming through to learn about these practices. So not only do these practices store carbon, but there's a list of practices that are supported by NRCS through their EQIP program and Cdfa through their Healthy Soils program. And this shows those lists that I hope others will put into place. So I want to thank you again for helping the ocean by helping the soil. And I want to thank our ranchers, Rebecca King and at Monkey Flower Ranch, and the Lopez's at Fiesta Farms for all their help, as well as all the other people who helped us, Cdfa, UC Cooperative Extension, the Resource Conservation Districts, NRCS. We had a lot of help and benefit from this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam. That was so clearly laid out and really interesting. Someone who's part of the Marine Carbon Project early on to see this applied in the Monterey region. Beautiful and exciting. And so in terms of moving our geography a little bit, here we're going to have a presentation by Gibson Durnford. Did I pronounce that right?
Absolutely.
Good. Okay. And Fibershed does work with community organizers, around 35 community organizers nationally and internationally. And one of the first sister Fibershed projects came out of the Hudson Valley. And it's been a really exciting project to see on the East Coast how, some of the ideas, we're in a semi-arid system here, and to see how carbon farming and soil health and water systems are coming together in a really beautiful way on the East Coast through another Fibershed, reaching out into the community to look at who the technical assistance community was for the fiber farming community. And so I'm going to pass it to you, Gibson, for full presentation. You got your
Excellent.
slides up. Thank you.
Hopefully you guys are getting those and
Yeah, they look
ready
great.
to go. Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Always happy to talk about our farms and our farmers who are amazing. I want to start off with just a quick introduction to New York City water supply. New Yorkers will not be shy about telling you all the great things about the city. The one thing we can all agree on is that we have amazing water. And that's something that we're actually very, very proud of. The water supply serves about 9.5 million people. That's roughly half of all of New York State. And we use a lot of water. It's more than 1 billion gallons a day that we go through. And that system, parts of it date back to the 1800s, and it's been expanded in the 1900s. It's made up of 19 reservoirs spaced throughout lower New York State. The oldest portions are just outside of the city. And then we have further watershed up in the Catskills that bring water down. The total storage is about 550 billion gallons. So, you know, a year and a half supply is stored in those reservoirs. It's a very unusual water supply in that it's primarily surface water. We don't rely on aquifers. It's water that falls from the sky, runs across the ground into streams and then into the reservoir system and then down to the city. It's also unfiltered, which is very unusual. The city does not use filtration. They'll use UV sanitation, but the water that comes out of the reservoir and comes out of my tap does not go through any sort of filtration. So source water protection has really been the approach that the city has taken. And that's a challenge because the watershed is roughly 2,000 square miles, covers 8 different counties and stretches into Connecticut. So we're dealing with a lot of local governments and state governments that all have thoughts on how that watershed is governed. The other challenge for us is that most of the watershed is privately owned. It's not state and federal land. It is held by private landowners. And most of that is in agricultural use. That's the single biggest use. We have a lot of woodland and working forestry, but we primarily have agriculture. And so that's where the Watershed Ag Council comes in. We work with farms to help them protect the water quality, but also to make sure that their farms are viable and that they can carry out best practices to keep farming, but also to ensure that the water that we're getting down in the city is the best possible water that it can be. And so there's a real push for conserving those landscapes, preserving the historical agriculture that we've had in those regions, and also keeping watershed communities involved in those decision makings. We do that through a series of whole farm plans. So it's a holistic look at whatever is happening on the farm. And then we use best management practices from NRCS to figure out how to solve potential pollution or existing pollution. So we never go into a farm and say, you can't do this or you can do this. We say, if you're going to do this, this is what we're going to need to address water quality and make sure that the water coming off your farm is as clean as possible. And we have no nutrient, we have no pathogens and no pesticides coming off. So it's a whole look. It works for the farmers. And I would point out that it's a voluntary program. We do not have any enforcement or regulatory authority over the farms. They participate because they want to be good stewards of the land and they want to help the city and they want to do the right thing. And that's a common theme that I think you'll see in farms. They want to do the right thing. They just don't always know how, and they don't always have the funding to do that. And this ties in with what Pam was saying earlier about making sure we have support continually available for them. I'm just going to jump forward to a snapshot of what we did in 2019. We have 335 active farms. That covers about 156,000 acres. Those are all small family farms. Most farms have been doing that for generations. We have at least 10 farms that are 200 years old and have been farming continuously. I know 156,000 acres is probably considered a small farm in California, but for us, that's quite a few. In 2019, we implemented 431 best management practices, and that was about a little more than $4.6 million worth of management practices. So not only will we go in and help them plan solutions, but we'll actually design and implement those solutions for the farmers. That's where the technical support comes in and the financial assistance. Of those BMPs that we implemented, more than half were soil health related. And you can see the list on the other side: nutrient management, cover crops, precision feed is about making sure that you're only giving the animals the feed they need to thrive and not anymore to create extra nutrient that you have to be concerned about. Forage and biomass plantings, creating buffers and grazing plans. So those are the things that we're implementing, and those are the most common BMPs that we implement. And remember, we're coming at this from a water quality point of view. If you were to say, okay, well, what could you do to address greenhouse gases? That list would be pretty much exactly the same. And there's a whole lot of crossover between water quality and carbon beneficial practices. You know, and if you did sort of the math on how much we could save in greenhouse gases, these would be exactly the practices, the conservation practices that you would want someone to implement. And I would also say, while we're talking about that, if you wanted to figure out how to best improve farm operations and make a difference for farm operations to save the farmer money, to really help with their operations, you would again end up with these exact same BMPs. We'll build all kinds of other things like compost facilities or covered manure pads or pits with flares, and they're all fancy and sexy BMPs. But the ones that really make a difference for water quality and greenhouse gases and farm operations are these ones that are most common, and they're also the cheapest ones to implement for the most part. They really require some technical assistance, but very, very economical for farms and for conservation agencies. So here's a bit of a surprise. We have all these farms operating in the New York City watershed, and New York City has actually determined that agriculture is a preferred land use. If they had their choice of anything in the watershed, they would really like it to be farms. And that comes as a shock to a lot of people because we often hear about ag pollution. But when a farm is well run and has the technical advice and assistance and is able to implement best practices, that is actually one of the best uses that you can have for that land. And New York City has a very large watershed protection plan to address that source water, and we are the single biggest part of that plan. To date, they've invested, the city has invested about, and I apologize, that's the New Yorker in me coming out saying the city. Again, New York City has invested about $250 million in the watershed agricultural plan. They're not doing that just because they love agriculture. It's a much better option for them. So dealing with ag pollutant where it occurs means they don't have to build a filtration plant. And when they were looking at that plant back in the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s, the price tag for that was about $10 million to build the plant and $100 million a year. So fast forward now, realistically, it's probably $15 billion to build and $200 million probably a year to operate that. So that environmental conservation in the field is a much better option for them to go with, and is why they're really investing in that. So, I have the privilege of working with lots of different farms, and I'm just going to sort of tie back up into some bigger thoughts. This is from one of our fiber farms, lovely alpaca farm, that is actually how I met Rebecca. We're able to do really effective environmental conservation and protect important resources with 335 farms, right? 335 farms are the main protection for the drinking water of half of New York State. So if you're looking for models on what implementation of best practices can do, whether that's greenhouse gas mitigation and reduction and sequestration, or if it's water quality, or if it's air quality, we can be a great model for that. And it works because we have an urban population that has actually recognized the value of that and is willing to invest in it. So I think that WAC and our ag program is really a great model that we can all look to, as we're trying to figure out ways that we can engage cities into agriculture and into resource protection. And with that, I think I ran pretty much on time. I'd love to save time for questions, so I'll hand it back to you. But again, it's a pleasure to be here, and our farms and forests are amazing.
Gibson, thank you so much.
Of course.
This is really exciting. So if those of you who are accumulating questions for Pam and Gibson, put them in the Q&A. And we are going to address those questions at the end of the presentations. So our next presenter is Dr. Laurie Flint, who is really holding up, in my experience of understanding California hydrology and its connection to soil organic carbon. It's been incredible to have the work of Lorrie and Alan at USGS to help us understand what's possible and what's going on in our system. So Lorrie, thank you for joining us today. And I will let you take it away with your slides. Perfect. Or someone else is putting them up. Good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, my husband and I have been working on regional scale water balance modeling for a lot of years, and got in touch with the Marin Carbon Project at one point and decided to see if we could revise the modeling to incorporate soil organic matter. So this is results of this work. So go to the next slide, please. I think that the first two panelists set me up really well to illustrate. I'm not going to have to do a lot of explaining probably, that the addition of compost to rangelands, grasslands, and croplands has been shown to improve soil health, forage and crop yields, increase soil water holding capacity, and reduce landscape demand for water, sequester carbon, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a win-win. Enhanced soil health and increased soil carbon can be achieved via numerous land management practices, as both of them showed very well. Next slide, please. So California's fourth climate change project had a portion on soil carbon that we got funded to do. And there were two main tasks of that. And we relied on the data from the task one to validate our model. It was done, field trials were done by UC Berkeley in conjunction with some of the original Marin Carbon Project work, to demonstrate that with field evidence that land use practices or the direct application of compost can sequester carbon, increase forage and crop productivity, and increase soil water holding capacity. Their result was that a one-time application of a 1/4 inch of compost achieved all these results over a period of 6 to 8 years, 9 years. And the biogeochemical modeling they did indicated that it continued without any additional applications. The impacts continued to increase for 30 years under future climate projections. Next slide, please. So that was really important results. And we were able then to take those results that were validated in our model and parameterized in our model to scale it up statewide. And so we used water balance modeling to illustrate for all working lands in California of those particular increased forage, enhanced water holding capacity, changes in hydrology and landscape stress, and further the reduction of future climate impacts. Next slide, please. The project area was the entire state of California and all of the working lands. So this is grasslands, shrublands, woodlands, and croplands. So these are any places where these practices could be tried out. Next slide. So the hydrologic benefit of soil management, and Pam went into this in some detail as well, has to do with what happens when you change the soil water holding capacity. So if you increase water holding capacity, you increase recharge because there's more water in the soil. You increase evapotranspiration because there's more water for plants. You decrease the runoff because more water can go into the soil, and you have a lower water deficit, which I'll explain in a minute, lower landscape stress, and less irrigation demand. So there's a lot of things you can do in a model to be able to do this. We did this on a 270-meter grid cell resolution. That's about 18 acres for the entire state. Next slide, please. If you zoom into some maps, the results are all in maps. This is runoff on the left and recharge on the right. This is a county level screenshot from the northern Sacramento Valley, and you can see the range of conditions and the discretization shown, how things really differ across the landscape with regard to hydrology. Next slide, please. So one of the variables that we can calculate in the model is the climatic water deficit. This is the annual evaporative demand that exceeds available water. So as your water supply decreases in a Mediterranean climate, you start getting plant growth and an actual ET. And then as the soil water is reduced, the deficit will accumulate over the season. This particular calculation, it integrates climate, energy holding capacity, drainage, soil moisture. It addresses irrigation demand because that deficit is what the plants, if you're growing a crop, you would have to supply to make up. And it defines a level of stress on the landscape. It's been correlated to wildfire risk and forest die-off and all sorts of other things. And the next slide, please, illustrates a map of what this looks like for the San Francisco Bay Area basins, where the Central Valley is in the browns and the coastal regions with fog and more rain are in the blues. And there's a lot of fine scale detail that can come out of a water deficit. Okay, next slide, please. So in practice, there were equations that were developed using tens of thousands of samples to determine what the change in soil water holding capacity is with different amounts of organic matter. So if we have baseline and we add organic matter, and this is from 1 to 5%, to calculate the increase in soil water content, you can see that it ranges quite a bit across the different soil types. And you can also see that it actually doesn't increase for very clayey soils. So the impact across the landscape is variable. And this also requires precipitation, or if you're in a cropland, irrigation, to take advantage of that increased storage to get benefit. So we ran this through the model. The next slide, please. With an increase of 1, 2, and 3% organic matter, and these are averages across all the different counties. So you can see there's a big range of differences, but you can also see this is inches of water in the soil. I live in Davis. I get 17 inches of rainfall on average a year, and this is a lot of increase in soil moisture storage if you have up to 3% organic matter. And you can see that there's a lot of variation across the state. So if we go to the next slide, we are isolating some model variables for discussion that have been talked about already. So increased water content increases the water available for plants. So that's our actual evapotranspiration. It's an indicator of net primary production, forage and crops, as has been shown now in both talks. Increased recharge and decreased runoff. So increased recharge is spatially variable across our landscape in our model because we have variable bedrock permeability. The decreased runoff is an indicator of lower peak flow, so you don't get contaminations as much or soil erosion. It also results in more late season base flow. So you're keeping water in the watershed, you're providing water in riparian zones and other locations. And the reduced water deficit is an indicator of the lower landscape stress and irrigation demand. And all of those processes reduce the impact of climate change. Next slide, please. So this is a statewide benefit from adding 3% of soil organic matter. Nearly on the left is recharge, on the right is actual ET, and nearly all locations have positive impacts from increases in soil organic matter. And most benefit is in locations that have enough precipitation to take advantage of the increase in soil storage. So you're seeing that in the perimeter, the farther north of the valley, and the perimeter all the way around the foothills. That being said, the central part of the Central Valley is mostly irrigated. So that is also can take a benefit of increasing in soil organic matter. Next slide, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit just to show you a little more detail. And the top one is recharge in Tehama County, northern Sacramento Valley, and you can see a lot of variation across the landscape. Climatic water deficit in Santa Barbara. These are all units in millimeters per year, and this is difference from baseline. So you can see a lot of locations where you're getting a decrease in water deficit. The blue colors are a decrease. And the bottom one is actual transpiration, evapotranspiration in Tulare County. And there's not a lot of an impact in the Central Valley, but you can see a lot of impact along the foothills where you're getting more, more precipitation. Next slide is showing an index that we created by scaling all of those 3 variables, adding them up, and then creating what we're calling a benefit map. So we have no benefit where none of the 3 variables have any, increase or decrease accordingly. And we have minimum, moderate, and maximum benefits. So you can see a lot of places, these are all of the working lands in California, and you can see that most places have some positive benefit. If we go to the next slide, this is zooming in to Sonoma County and Marin County. There are places in this landscape, the left-hand side is the vegetation types. The right-hand side is showing that there are some locations where there's no benefit. Either that's because the soil organic matter is already high enough that you're not going to increase the benefit by adding more carbon or organic matter, and other places is where you actually need to have working lands in this particular location. So in Sonoma County, there are a number of places where you could target to get maximum benefit from all 3 of those variables. So my last slide is some take-home messages. So nearly all rangelands and working lands benefit from strategic soil management, however you want to get there. Very few locations do not benefit due to soil texture or low rainfall. Increases in soil organic matter of up to 3% resulted in increases in soil water storage capacity, crop and forage production, recharge, decreases in water deficit, and reduction in the impacts of climate change. I didn't show you those results, but they were spatially variable across the landscape as well. Implications of improved soil health to biodiversity and things that are a little bit bigger processes show that late season base flows enhance stream and riparian habitats. We can show that increased grassland productivity encourages more species of plants, insects, and other food sources for birds and animals. Lower water deficit lowers demand of plants for water and extends the growing season. And all of these results highlight the locations that would hydrologically benefit the most and the least from soil management. All locations have some carbon sequestration, however. So the point being is that if you have to target something, you want to do it in locations that if you have limited resources, you have 20 farms, some of them are not going to benefit because of their soil type or their access to irrigation water or whatever. There's places you want to try to prioritize to be able to enhance the soil health specifically targeted. That being said, I model it for the whole state of California. And if you were to get 3% increase in soil organic matter for all of those pixels that we modeled, you could get something like 3 million acre feet per year of soil water storage capacity increase. So, I mean, it's something that if you can scale up, and I know that Wendy Silver from UC Berkeley wants to do it for all grasslands in the world because she thinks that we could actually reverse climate change. And it's not that unrealistic of a pipe dream, really, when you think about how people are potentially could come together with some very simple and strategic management actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lori. And I think this also resonates with one of our fireside chat conversations yesterday around using solutions that are just abundantly available, like organic matter and making compost, something that all communities also have access to. So this is not necessarily coming together as a community is what it will require, but in terms of a high-tech solution, we've been making compost for millennia. And I'm very excited to hear all of you speaking together. Each of your work is so so exciting when compiled in this format. So thank you. And all right, so in terms of compost, Janaki, I'm thinking of colleagues actually who do cotton work in India, and the like 400 different composting recipes that have come out of Indian cotton production systems, and just thinking, reflecting on your work to think about, you know, who's instituting the best management practices, who has access to be able to implement these practices, who has access to the land, and, you know, how do we do this work thinking about the human community. And so I'm really grateful for an opportunity to share this time with you as well, to bring some of that narrative forward. So I'll let you take it from here. Thank you, Janaki.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everybody. It's really been really illuminating to hear from the three other panelists today too. I didn't expect to kind of have such a deep reaction hearing from everybody else, but it's just been so long since I think I've heard some really good news and like things that are really forward looking, and hearing from all of you has been great. And so I just really wanted to you know, use this opportunity, since we've all been hearing, you know, about these different forms of watershed management, of land management, and we've heard about the NRCS quite a bit today, to just kind of pull back for a moment and to think about, you know, take us back in history a little bit to when the NRCS was formed in the United States, and the historic and socio-political circumstances that led to the creation of that, and kind of to move us into the modern day, thinking about what the solutions are, and really, as far as I'm concerned, you know, where the places are within California where there unfortunately has been large oversight and has resulted in tremendous environmental justice inequities that predominantly impact farm worker communities. So my name is Janaki Jagannath. I'm a program manager with the 11th Hour Project now, and a proud supporter of Fibershed, and also we also support a number of organizations that conduct legal and policy advocacy for a just transition from industrial agriculture, located in the San Joaquin Valley. So I'll be talking about kind of both of those. But to start, I thought I would just, you know, read a short passage from The Grapes of Wrath. Actually, I don't know if folks are remember that novel. It was 1938 when it came out, but a lot of what I'm talking about today really is the fact that for a lot of the communities that are written about in that novel, not a lot has changed. And when we talk about shifting these management practices, a lot of it has to do with where power is concentrated. So reflecting on the Dust Bowl, which resulted in the creation of the NRCS, and kind of the last time that the United States collectively took a look down at its own 2 feet and said, well, we need to start taking care of this thing underneath us. This is one of the passages that really resonated with me in terms of how California's agriculture developed after the creation of the NRCS and the Dust Bowl migration into California. Now farming became industry, and the owners followed Rome. And although they did not know it, they imported slaves, although they didn't call them such. Chinese, Japanese, Mexicans, Filipinos, they lived on rice and beans, the businessmen said. They don't need much. They wouldn't know what to do with good wages. Why look how they live? Why look what they eat? And if they get funny, report them. And all the time, the farms grew larger and the owners fewer. And there were pitifully few farmers on the land anymore. And the imported serfs were beaten and frightened and starved until some went home again. And some grew fierce and were killed or driven from the country. And the farms grew larger and the owners fewer. And the crops changed. Fruit trees took the place of grain fields, and vegetables to feed the world spread out on the bottoms. Lettuce, cauliflower, artichokes, potatoes, stoop crops. A man may stand to use a scythe, a plow, a pitchfork, but he must crawl like a bug between the rows of lettuce. He must bend his back and pull his long bag between the cotton rows. He must go on his knees like a penitent across a cauliflower patch. And it came about that the owners no longer worked on their farms. They farmed on paper, and they forgot the land, the smell, the feel of it, and remembered only that they owned it, remembered only what they gained and lost by it. And some of the farms grew so large that one man could not even conceive of them anymore, so large that it took batteries of bookkeepers to keep track of interest and gain and loss, chemists to test the soil, to replenish, straw bosses to see that the stooping men were moving along the rows as swiftly as the material of their bodies could stand. So that's just a short, piece to just remind us the historical context within which many communities continue to exist in the San Joaquin Valley of California, which used to be quite a large cotton producer, still continues to produce a large amount of Pima cotton, which is for export. And 95% of the cotton that's produced in the valley is for export. So I will go ahead and share my screen. So I just wanted to quickly review the definition of environmental justice, at least under California law: the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. You know, just a definition to kind of keep in mind as we think about how soil policy and hopefully the advancement of climate change policy that intersects with soil health continues in our state. And this is a map here of CalEnviroScreen, which this is for folks who are involved in kind of climate policy. This may not be a terribly new map, but this shows us, this is maybe many of us in the environmental justice movement would say this is one of the greatest achievements of our state in the last 20 years, is to map where there are cumulative socioeconomic burdens and environmental pollution burdens that are overlapped in our most agriculturally productive region of the state. And as you can see, that's the area here highlighted in red and orange. So some of the indicators, and I highly recommend anybody to go online to CalEnviroScreen and plug in your own zip code and see where you fall on this map. But these red zones are areas that have a compounded burden of both socioeconomic factors, including asthma rates, age, low income, educational attainment, household income, etc. And then on the other side, we see the pollution burden score showing things like particulate matter, proximity to a hazardous waste facility, groundwater quality, local air quality, and those kinds of pollution scores that are collected by Cal EPA. So it's not really a surprise to anybody seeing that along the center of the state here, in our most agriculturally productive regions, we also deal with these environmental hazards. There's just a little bit of a closer view here. The region in the upper Bay Area is quite green, and I think, you know, just seeing Lorrie's maps are also kind of bringing back how there's areas that have existing amounts of soil organic matter, and also kind of looking at this red area, which, you know, we also looked at kind of the climatic water deficit in the Central Valley, which is of course compounded by the extraction of our groundwater table by industrial agriculture. So just to kind of look at some of the communities that, again, as we're talking about this kind of watershed management and the intersection of soil health and water quality, the people who are in the cracks and crevices of this big agricultural tapestry that is California oftentimes are disadvantaged unincorporated communities, or these legacy communities that, as I was saying, not a lot has changed since the Dust Bowl for them. These are communities that started out as tent settlements or farm worker communities, and over time are now sort of permanent settlements. So these are areas that are located in these neglected areas across the state, and these are primarily at this moment Latinx, monolingual Spanish speaking, and indigenous language speaking communities. These are areas that, as mentioned, are unincorporated, meaning that local cities, whether it's through overt racism or just the history of redlining in California, have left those communities out of having access to basic services, including water treatment. And unfortunately, here in California, in this region, you know, the disparity in water access is such that over 1 million people lack access to clean and affordable drinking water, mostly rural communities who, as we heard from Gibson earlier, talking about kind of source water protection as a way to achieve high quality water at the user at the use point. Unfortunately, in the Central Valley, that hasn't been such a priority, because the people who are consumers of water are extremely poor, usually don't have the money for treatment, and through the history of how the state has developed, the priority has not been placed on that source water protection. But for the majority of those communities, they are directly pulling from the groundwater from the aquifer with usually very shallow wells. So those are issues that continue to plague these communities. And they're critically tied to the economic development of California. These are farm worker communities that have borne the burden of kind of building our economy. And just again, some of the public health challenges that these communities face. And I've used the phrase colonia here. However, that's like, that is a term that's used primarily for kind of like border communities along the southern United States-Mexico border. But many of the same issues sort of face a lot of these residents in the San Joaquin Valley. And so oftentimes, you'll see interchangeable use of the word colonia and disadvantaged unincorporated community. Of course, we see here a lack of governance, and places of employment are extremely narrow. Housing has been just sort of built by hand, and lack of code enforcement and protection, and lack of access to safe and affordable drinking water continues to be an issue. So just to tie this back to kind of agricultural land holding and fiber, just a great example of kind of the fiber's role in the settling and the creation of the agricultural industry in the state. The Boswell Farms, many people may be familiar, the world's largest privately owned farmland, and this is 135,000 acres in Fresno and Kings County. This region was drained, basically the Boswell family drained the Tulare Lake Basin for the purpose of farming cotton there. And anybody who's read the book King of California, this is a sort of an interesting narrative in how the industrial agricultural treadmill was kind of begun in the state, and resulted in numerous settlements in this region of California that continue to exist today. Here is just kind of a context for where the cotton industry is today in California. It's certainly not at the same level of other commodity crops, but I also placed the citation here just to show how much of our data is continues to be collected by research programs that are funded by industrial agriculture. So William Horwath is a professor who is a part of the Boswell endowed chair at Davis. So this is kind of it's just good to keep in mind the kind of revolving door between industrial agriculture and the way data is collected. This is just one of the communities here in that region that continues to deal with some of these impacts. This is called El Progreso, or El Porvenir. Oftentimes they have multiple different names, because these communities in the anarchic development of California kind of have shed their having an identity, and they hardly appear on Google Maps or on any mapping program at all, because these are cities and counties don't know that these communities exist, and so that they continue to be discovered because they're tent settlements that are kind of continuing to deal with these environmental inequities and are home to shifting populations of temporary and permanent seasonal and permanent workers. There's some of the housing in one of these neighborhoods, and this is just right next door, the almond orchard, just to show kind of the community that you saw previously was one that during the peak of the drought, the county actually shut off water entirely to that community because they were unable to pay the rates for the treatment and the transportation of that water. But across the street are agricultural producers who are able to run large agricultural pumps. So I mean, these are all kind of, these are intersecting issues that we've been discussing all day that are agroecological, and in the sense that we're talking about land management, we're talking about watershed management, and we're also talking about the access to the political process for the communities that are kind of caught in between all of these different processes, and who maybe are not considered watershed communities that should be at the table having a seat in at the administrative process, determining how these choices are made. But it's my hope that, after having spoken on this panel today, and that all of us can kind of engage in a dialogue about what does it take to both shift the political perceptions of soil management so that we're advancing also the environmental justice priorities of the state and giving back to the communities that have helped build California, and rather than allowing them to blow away in the dust once again, as a lot of communities did during the Dust Bowl. There's some questions for us to consider together. How does the work that you do with fiber intersect with power holding in agriculture? And how does the access to land, the power in agriculture intersect with our protection of soil?
Those are wonderful questions. And do you want to, we could even leave them up.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. And we have, Janaki, thank you so much. Yeah, this is extremely, I'd love to leave this slide up, and then also to follow with our time frame, I'm going to ask each of you a few questions, and I want to pull this discussion in. So what actually, well, why don't we just reflect on those first, because they're fresh, if that's okay. Pam, Lorrie, Gibson, do you, and I can also chime in here, specifically on this point of how does power holding in agriculture intersect with soil health? And we're not asking for like this to be something that we're all experts at right now, because it's actually a panel where we're we're in the process of creating intersections. I would say it's not formulated, but are there any top of mind ideas that you have about the work that you've done and the light you see at the end of the tunnel for how these things come together? Any top of mind ideas?
I could make a couple of comments that with regard to the trying to actually upscale the processes and have more of an impact. I think you need to actually have incentives and policy, and the agricultural power holding is going to impact, they're going to have lobbyists, and they're going to impact policy at a statewide level. So I think that things like carbon credits and all sorts of other incentives that can move practices forward, even though the ones in the big, large agricultural powerhouses in the valley are generally less sustainable. The big policy things are what are going to end up changing things, because that's where you get the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, for example. And those are things that when they have to start managing their groundwater, they have to start thinking about other ways to make sure the water gets back into the soil. And I think soil health is just one of those factors that plays into the role of that whole process.
Thank you, Lorrie. Yeah, and there's a good article, I think, in The Guardian about how there's still so many community water districts that aren't hooked up to municipal systems, and their wells keep going dry, spitting air and sand, and have nitrate contamination. And we want that Groundwater Act to work, and we, I guess I keep coming up with this, how do we build enough representation? To Lorrie's point, big ag's going to have a role in the policy, even though the Groundwater Act is super important and powerful. It gives us like a 10-year span to implement. And I think there's like a lot of stuff that can happen in the next 10 years that could be detrimental to the health of the water system and the people who rely on it in the interim. But I am curious about how we just help support better representation from the communities you're describing, Janaki, getting more people to the table with the voices directly who are living through the experience. Janaki, do you want to speak to any of your work trying to organize people and how that's gone?
Yeah, maybe before saying that, I just to your question of kind of what are the positive points of intersection for us here. is just like, seeing Laurie's work really was kind of illuminating, because when I look at CalEnviroScreen, and I should, say that CalEnviroScreen, I think I failed to mention this, was CalEnviroScreen was created as a way to ensure that state climate investments through the cap and trade program are reinvested into those red areas in the middle of the state. So there's actually a statutory requirement of 25% of state climate investments to be placed into green projects in these areas that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And if we were able to actually place, soil organic matter as a indicator within CalEnviroScreen, or to show kind of how improvement of soil also is tied to better human health outcomes in these areas, that's something that we already have kind of the policy infrastructure to make a positive improvement with it. So just something that I would love to kind of follow up with folks about, with Lorrie about.
Lorrie, what do you think of a map that coalesces some of the mapping you saw with increases in soil organic matter?
Unfortunately, the Central Valley is the places that she had that were red. If you were increasing, I mean, it's active soil management. There's a lot of tilling, things like that, where, and in order to fulfill the soil water, you have to pull out groundwater or some other means of irrigating. So the overlay in the Central Valley is not as neutral or beneficial as you would hope.
Yeah, because they're working with water from other watersheds.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it would still be interesting to see what a minimization of tillage, how much water can we reduce from the irrigation requirement? Maybe there's some really interesting ways we can start seeing a reduction in how much is pumped as a starting.
The Marin Carbon Project has been able to show that there's places in the Central Valley that you can increase your soil organic matter with intensive management by 8 to 12%. I mean, it's huge. And so,
Wow.
It depends on what your crop is. It depends. There's all kinds of implications. And if you look across the landscape and you have maps, like the kind of maps that I produce, you can actually think about where you want to target that it could even potentially be beneficial.
Very cool. Well, thank you both for helping us take some time, like live, to feel out where there's merge lanes here and opportunities to have the science support, a broad scale vision for San Joaquin Valley. Thank you both. And if it's okay, I am gonna pivot to like 2 questions, and then we have questions from the audience in the Q&A that have been voted on, and I'm gonna ask those. And the one question I had, just to come back to Gibson and the New York City watershed, can you share a carbon farming narrative or a specific story from the field that elucidates your relationship with the New York Textile Lab?
Sure, that would be great. So I was, one of our farms is a relatively large alpaca farm that is in commercial production. And we have a whole farm plan that deals with water quality. The farmer was really interested in carbon farming and Fibershed. And so we took a look at her whole farm plan and realized that we could basically translate it into a carbon farm plan with very little modification. So that was kind of the introduction on what we could do, and that involved maybe reprioritizing things, adding in some additional best management practices that we would maybe have not otherwise prioritized. But we've been able to put together a really great carbon farm plan for her with calculations in terms of greenhouse gases sequestered, And that has really led me into working with Laura Sansone, who is with the New York Textile Project. And I see is actually answering some of the questions in the chat room. So thank you, Laura. And reaching out to other fiber producers in the Hudson Valley, especially, but around New York State. And we are seeing a really big push from fiber producers who are really, really interested in developing carbon farm plans and conservation plans that will help them implement practices that will sequester carbon. So it's been really exciting. The farm we're still doing work with, we just put in some water lines, the original sort of contact farm. We put in some water lines to increase grazing. We're working on a compost facility. And at that compost facility, we will, I know there's been a question, we'll collect manure, bedding, straw, and compost that, rotating it, and then that will be spread back on the fields. And we've worked on a bunch of other management practices to come up with a really, really strong carbon farm plan for them. So that's been really exciting, and it's really introduced me to a whole other side of agriculture, even beyond the watershed. Like I said, we stretch into that very narrow area, but there are farmers from across the state and the Northeast who are interested in doing this. And we have the benefit of having New York City, and I know right now getting enough fiber is our challenge to meet the demand that we're getting from New York City. So that's also a good situation to be in. Yeah.
There's beautiful sweaters I'm seeing from these landscapes where land restoration is occurring. And there was a question that, let's see, for you that I want to make sure. So the question, very excited to learn of New York's BMP program success. Can this model be modified and applied to West Coast farms with the same expected success rate for both drinking water and farming productivity, considering the difference in weather?
You know, it's a tricky question, but the practices that we're implementing are all from NRCS. So they are proven, scientifically based, and replicable. So these are well demonstrated to be conservation practices. So they are good, you know, across the country. And they may need some modification. What they look like here, where we're dealing with, you know, climate change for us looks like more rain and heavier storms. Obviously, that's very different from what California is experiencing. But the you know, the practices that USDA is developing are you know, for the whole country. So they may need some tweaking, but they are definitely able to be implemented. And in terms of the approach, it's a little more complicated because you guys have a much more complicated water supply. And I know it comes from much further away, and there's often different areas involved. So, but I think that, you know, if as a model, I think it does work, and I think it is replicable, and it's something that we kind of wonder, you know, why is it not adopted more? And we're seeing it, you know, Chesapeake Bay is now investing in the watershed significantly because we know they've had lots of problems with phosphorus. And they're right across the mountains from us. Basically, they're our western edge. So they stretch out over to, I think Ithaca was one of the questions that was also there. So they're in a different watershed. They're slower behind, but they're now also recognizing that downstream communities need to invest in upstream conservation. And that's really the key to making it work.
And so does anyone have on the panel have comments about that where urban areas understand and support agricultural transformations in agriculture to support a healthy water supply? How does that reflect or connect to any of our California landscapes for Pam, Lorrie, or Janaki?
I haven't really seen an urban area supporting the ag systems in California, but we do have grants that come from different sources that support that, and support a lot of the same practices that have been used successfully there, used here, the NRCS practices. Those are the ones that are in the Healthy Soils program from the California Department of Food and Agriculture. Many of the regional water quality control boards also have grant money that supports similar kinds of practices. And NRCS has EQIP money that farmers can apply for that support the same practices too. So it's a different source, but funding similar practices.
Thank you. Lorrie or Janaki, do you have any comments about urban communities or even peri-urban communities supporting transformations in agriculture to enhance or protect water?
I think that my comment that associated with that would be that there are major efforts. And an example would be the city of San Francisco that is supporting the development of compost by recycling all of their restaurant waste and their airport waste and trying to facilitate the transport of these materials to reduce the carbon footprint to add to the Healthy Soils program. So it's kind of it's the only thing, it's the only example I can think of that there's a major impact on trying to improve the soil. That doesn't necessarily, they don't get their water from those places. So unless it's local, there are actually local things in the San Francisco Bay Area where they are supporting some of the watershed development and small agricultural efforts throughout the San Francisco Bay Area.
It's a really good example of the compost creation process that we can create. And there was a question about compost. Oftentimes some of the compost that we're seeing that works best in some of our farmlands has a 50-50 nitrogen carbon ratio, and the carbon can come from urban landscapes when we're pruning trees in cities or in gardens. It can come from agricultural vegetation or biomass that's not being used for food or fiber. Some of that material, sometimes even in California is historically burned. So instead of burning, putting it into a composting system, and then urban food waste being a nice wet material with a lot more nitrogen. So if you have those carbonaceous and nitrogenaceous materials coming from urban and maybe rural sources, then we have compost, and then compost is what we have to put back on these landscapes, which ties into that beautiful mapping about how we mitigate the climate water deficit and how we enhance surface water flow. So urban communities have a big role to play. So that's a really great example. Janaki, did you have other ideas about connecting the urban populace to water health as it relates to ag and ag practice?
Yeah, I just wanted to lift up one of the things in the chat. Somebody had mentioned Robin Mitchell's statement that there's a new composting mandate that will require cities to do more composting. So what that's in reference to is the short-lived climate pollutants plan, which is a California policy to get away from just counting carbons under the cap and trade program, but to also focus on black carbon, hydrofluorocarbons, and methane. And so a big task of that policy is to reduce the amount of methane coming off of our landfills. And it is a kind of a groundbreaking in the sense that it is creating this program that's both in sort of rural cities and larger cities to ensure that there's composting at home, as well as community composting sites available, and like kind of wide variety of different scales of composting to achieve these goals. And it's my hope that we're able to do it during the time of this virus, since so much of composting infrastructure development is contingent on the human to human connection, especially when it comes to community composting sites. But yeah, that's just a good thing to keep in mind. And again, those policies are also kind of focused around CalEnviroScreen and the assurance that the benefits of whatever those programs have to reach those red zones in California, at least to a certain degree under the law. So, this is just to bring it back to principles of environmental justice, and that California, not by any of its own kind of independent goodwill, but because of strong advocacy by local communities, have sort of ensured that these programs are tied back to ensuring that those residents who are most impacted feel the benefits first.
Yeah, and thank you for connecting So organic material is being kept out of landfill increasingly more. I don't know if is it by 2030 that we cannot have organic material in our landfill? I think we have to divert it within a certain amount of time, which
75% reduction, I think.
75% reduction. So that gives us more opportunity to produce the organic material into compost form again. I'm going to keep going back to our Q&A from the group that's listening. They have a lot of great questions. Maris Butler asks, what about the future of animals who provide fiber? Do you see this as a growing component with more designers like myself who want to focus on more local and sustainable materials? Any comments on that? The future.
I can jump in just, in that we've seen a real increase in demand, and that's exciting. I think it's hard for farms in the Northeast. We have a real processing limitation in the Northeast for fiber, and that has been something that I have learned about as I dive more into fiber, but is a real barrier. So our farms can produce fiber and could scale up, but then it kind of runs into a roadblock on what happens next. So that's been the biggest barrier for us growing, and we would love to be able to bring more fiber. And I know that with Fibershed in New York that I'm working with, fields calls all the time, and is now sort of at the challenge of making sure we can meet all that need. So that's certainly a question, but there is demand, and if we can bring more farms into the program, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Gibson. Yeah, and the sweaters, I keep saying, beautiful. Like Hudson Valley sweaters are what you kind of want to live your life out of. Very soft. You have a lot of alpaca community members there. It's beautiful. Pam and Lorrie, Janaki, anything you'd like to add to Maris Butler's question about what is the future of the fiber animals in relationship to this conversation, and what do you see as a component for designers like she to think about when they're localizing?
Well, I know that the rancher that I work with at Monkey Flower Ranch, she primarily uses her sheep for milk and dairy, but she's interested in also starting to use them for fiber. So maybe starting to find animals that can have multiple benefits, both supply food and fiber. That there could be a real advantage of that, doing both with the same animal. So, and then like somebody said, maybe even if she even composted the fiber that wasn't usable for clothing production, that could be another use of that fiber that comes off of her animals. So that's one idea.
Thank you, Pam. Yeah, dual purpose, very important. There's another question I want to get to, but Lorrie, did you have anything to add about? Oh, I hear laughing from the back. Not supposed to ask one more question. Janaki, one more quick question. How do we help communities that you discussed today in your beautiful presentation get their seat at the table? From Christina Wheeler.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. I put some info into the chat, which was not the Q&A box, but yeah, so in not too distant past, I was a coordinator of Community Alliance for Agroecology, which is an alliance of 6 organizations that help to pass the Human Right to Drinking Water, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, have been active on the front lines with the climate change sort of earmarks with the Calendar screen. So those organizations include Community Water Center, the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, Californians for Pesticide Reform, and El Quinto Sol de America. And those groups are you can access all of those that I rattled off by just going to community at allianceforagroecology.org. And those, there's minimal organizations and legal and policy representation for these remote rural communities. So when I tell you that these are the folks doing grassroots work, they can you can take it at face value. And I would be happy to follow up individually with anybody who wants to be more involved, kind of either in funding, since I'm now in philanthropy, and also people who are interested in kind of volunteering their time with any of these groups.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for having an intersectional conversation. May it be the first of many. And also very just exciting to hear so many great questions. Thank you to the audience for integrating so much wonderful science, environmental justice, and then the design element, the material culture that precipitates from all of this baseline work. Thank you for those who are makers and designers who attended today. Really grateful for your participation.